Welcome to Fintech Impact. This podcast is an exploration of the financial technology world, interviewing different fintech entrepreneurs about what they do, their story, and what their impact is on consumers, incumbents, and the industry as a whole. Here's your host, award-winning financial planner, university lecturer, and writer, Jason Pereira.
Hello and welcome to the show. First piece of housekeeping, just a reminder, as I mentioned before, I will be speaking at the Wealth Professional Summit on Leadership and Technology on May 30th in Toronto. For anyone who's interested, the subject will be Tools for an Efficient Advisor Office or something to that effect once I figure out a name. So today, moving forward, on to our guest, Pawel Brzeminski. Pawel Brzeminski is the founder and CEO of Snap Projections. Snap Projections is a relatively new financial planning software in the Canadian market, and we talked at length about tools and challenges to the Canadian financial planner and how he's helping to try to meet those. In addition to that, Pawel also runs a podcast on growing your financial advisory practice. I just so happen to be lucky enough to be the guest on the 6th episode of his podcast, and I think it went very well. We will attach a link to that in the show notes for anyone who's interested in listening. And with that, here's my interview with Pawel. Hello, Pawel.
Hi, Jason.
Thank you for joining me.
I'm super excited. Thank you.
Good. Well, it's nice. You get to return the favor. I was on your podcast the other day, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So, Pawel, tell us about Snap Projections.
So Snap Projections is financial planning software for Canadian financial advisors, investment managers, and financial planners. We focus more, and I think we'll probably get into more detail a little later on, but we focus more on the kind of mass affluent market. So just not very high ends, just millions of dollars of really huge clients with a lot of complexity, but really helping sort of more average advisors and advisors who plan for larger clients as well, but just kind of be much more efficient with their process and really help a lot more people with financial planning.
Good. So we'll come back to that in a second. Now tell us about you, your background, and your journey to start this company.
That's a long conversation, but okay. Well, let's do it. Let's do it quickly. So, my background is software engineer, so it's just that's technical background. But it's kind of interesting how I ended up looking at starting Snap Projections, because when I actually came to Canada over 15 years ago, at a time I for the first time I really noticed that Europeans and people in Canada here, probably US as well, they think about money differently and they make different decisions. So, for example, there's not a lot of credit card use in Europe, and the same with checks. I think checks are only in UK. So, for example, maybe just a cultural differences, but I noticed that people make different decisions and financial decisions. And I very quickly noticed that some people would pay, just those, 20 plus 22, 3% interest rates on credit cards. And I just couldn't really understand that. So it was starting bugging me, but it was a long time ago. And I think, so through my journey, basically working with larger companies and building other software-based companies, I essentially in 2014, I started going back to this kind of financial planning or just really financial market. And I started talking with financial advisors, and I didn't set out to build financial planning software. This wasn't the initial idea. It was really starting with, how can I help this industry? How can I help Canadians make better financial decisions? So people have more the peace of mind when they're still working and better quality when they retire. And when I started speaking with advisors, I think, 30, maybe 40, 50 people in, just very quickly, we've noticed that there's some big challenges with in terms of planning. And this is where it all started. So this very quickly led me to really just focusing more on the planning side. And then we started late 2014, we started actually building a product. We launched around May 2015. So almost 3 years ago.
Good. So basically, you were talking to a lot of advisors about what it was that they needed and what it was, I guess they were talking about their limitations on financial planning software, and that's what led you to this?
Yeah. So, Jason, you're an advisor, so I'm sure you have a lot of comments and opinions on financial planning software, but very quickly, we'll get to those. Very quickly, I noticed that just even the basic functions, for example, entering data or creating plans, creating projections for clients, this would take a lot of time, a lot of effort for advisors, because existing tools were just very old. Sometimes they were very old, maybe not updated, maybe a little bit, I would say, clunky even. And so technology was kind of wasn't really updated. So that was kind of obvious thing. And then we got to the point that actually the output from the planning software, so the reports that were generated were very complex. So average consumers would not be able to consume those reports and understand those reports. And sometimes advisors wouldn't understand them as well, right? And planning is not about entering the data and printing out the plan and giving to the client. There's more.
The old 200-page data dump where here it is, and maybe that'll just prove that I've done a lot of work.
Exactly. And just completely doesn't make sense. And I think the industry is changing very quickly. And it's a lot more about education right now. And there's some independent even studies talking about that education, actually, the advisor can help increase the financial literacy of their client, their referability goes up. So that was a very interesting observation. And the last thing was really that, just to focus on the education aspect, if you can sit down with a client and you can have much more interactive conversation, it's not about building the plan with them when they sit and watch you, right? But it's about you looked at their data, you built a couple of scenarios, but let's say they forgot about assets, or they say there is an inheritance coming down the road, right? And if you can make those changes very quickly, we've noticed that this really engages clients. A lot of advisors either would meet, let's say, with their clients in their offices, or even maybe over just, let's say, Zoom or Skype, just video conferencing, and they would have those sessions. And those sessions became very quickly something that those advisors and their clients, they were telling them that are super valuable. So there was actually one session I remember. There was one advisor from Montreal that he told me, hired an advisor, and he told me that he would project the output from the software on the large screen, and the clients would just come up to certain numbers, and they would just point to numbers, and they started talking about their life, about their goals. So he told me that the software allows him to show the life of the client on one page, essentially.
And tell us about the interface, because I mean, what you've done is, I got to say, very simplified, but frankly, very effective and very, in that way, powerful. So.
Well, I think there's a lot of product decisions that went into it, because when you're developing any product, it's not just financial planning. For maybe even to me, it seemed like an easier problem to solve, right? Because you have a couple of assumptions about there's inflation, maybe rates of return, and maybe, of course, income, assets, and debt, and maybe some corporate assets. And how complex can it be, right? But very quickly,
very complex.
Exactly.
For the mass market, yes, I think something. A lot of times these plans try to smash a fly with a hammer. But yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. My practice, we deal with super advanced cases that, frankly, you'll get dizzy just trying to follow up of keep track of everything going on. But that's the exception, not the rule.
Exactly. And really even simpler plans, there is a lot of complexity in them, because I think, financial planning, it's not, we're not doing differential equations. We're not doing advanced math. But the problem is that there's a lot of moving pieces. And let's say you go to the age of, 66, and you start making RIF withdrawals maybe a little bit earlier. That's going to affect maybe your TFSA or non-registered withdrawals, right? And if you cannot see how this information flows and updates very quickly, then you're going to be spending a lot of time on that. So before actually even starting developing the software, we thought about what would be our assumptions about the product? What are sort of product core beliefs? So we have this 5 core beliefs, and all starting with software being effective. And we can actually go one by one to this if you're interested, because that's really helps us to shape the software in a certain way. Really, the first belief though was that the software had to be effective, and it really needed to genuinely help Canadians make better financial decisions. So it's just not about leading to product sales, right? If the product is appropriate, then of course the product sales makes sense, right? But it's going to be all about making people better decisions. And the other belief, and I don't think a lot of people have this kind of belief, especially in the fintech space, but I do believe that we cannot replace an advisor. I think financial planning it's not an area where we can actually replace an advisor. I think I'm more thinking about equipping a great fiduciary mindful advisor with amazing tools so that advisor can be extremely efficient, but it's not about replacing the advisor, right?
Interesting. I think there's definitely 2 camps. That there's the entire we're going to replace all humans approach that I've definitely seen, and the likes of Wealthfront have very much pushed. But it's interesting. And one of the reasons why I started the podcast is because the vast majority of the fintechs I meet typically are looking to work in collaboration with advisors. And I think for the very reasons that we're going to discuss or we've discussed elsewhere, which is essentially like, there's a human element here that cannot be crossed by fintech. You're dealing with people's emotions, their sensitivities, their preferences, these are things that, you can't quite quantify.
Absolutely. So we think about planning tool as a tool that basically is going to help and maybe nudge and guide the advisor and the client. So for example, to see the issues and opportunities, right? And we definitely have a lot of work to get fully there, because I think there's amazing opportunities, and then we're just at a starting point. But that was really the first sort of tenet, effective, right? Then there is ease of use. And, you might be laughing because I think every software vendor on the planet would say that their software is easy to use, but I think we really wanted to focus on the software to be easy to use. So you don't need the PhD in math to figure it out, right? You don't have to be calling support with every single click. And also, so we don't want to charge advisors for training them on the software, which I thought it's quite ridiculous. So And of course, the other aspect, it has to be built on sound assumptions that are simple, they're easy to understand, and they're also easy to communicate to the advisor and the client. So that was another aspect. And there's a couple of more. I think the robustness also was something that was really important for us, because we wanted to have the tool that it generates powerful and useful and meaningful output, but it generates this output very quickly as well. So the way how we build the software, the way how we laid it out, it actually allows for that. And then you can go and make those quick changes and updates, and you are saving a lot of time as an advisor. So that's basically is the interactivity aspect. And there's two other things, customization. So that's kind of more obvious thing. But we wanted also for the software to be incredibly customizable. So you can actually model a variety of client situations. Because in a lot of cases, we're talking with advisors and they said, I like the software that I'm using, but you know what? I cannot make those changes about withdrawals, especially right now when we're entering the large decumulation, I would say, phase. I think there are a lot of opportunities, and I think financial planning, it's not purely science, right? There's science and there's some hard numbers and there's soft aspects as well. So you have to, as an advisor, sometimes you have to make sure that you analyze the client's needs and priorities. And sometimes we don't have this information in the software, so we cannot use this to actually make decisions. So we have to enable to the advisor to be able to modify how the software works, the engine, and also the idea that creating simple plans should be quick, because if you're illustrating simple situation, you should be blazingly fast with that process, but you have to be able to model more complex situations. So that's customization. And the last thing is I would just mention, it's accuracy and transparency, right? So accuracy is more on the tax side. So the software adheres to latest tax legislation to the extent it basically attempts to, at least, and transparency as well, because in order for the advisor, and we've heard this many, many times on the phone with advisors, they need to have the confidence in the numbers. So sometimes they have to be able to review the calculations. It's not about the black box sort of predictive model that automatically comes up with the best answer, right? They should be able to see how the calculations were derived. So these are the kind of 5 elements I think may sound pretty complex. So this was really the starting point for us to build the software. We actually had to agree on something first, and then we sort of proceeded with building software.
So I got to say, I actually found your choice for the interface to be simple yet bold and actually cutting to the chase. So, I mean, for listeners who haven't visited the site yet, you look at it first and it looks like an online spreadsheet. But the ability to dig deep and actually make a lot of changes you just discussed, and have it update in real time. And the thing that I think that's actually quite brilliant about it is that a lot of us will put in all kinds of data into the financial planning software, and just to get to the point where the software spits out the spreadsheet that we can audit and ensure it's correct. You basically baked that into the UI in the first place. So well done.
Yeah, and I think, I think this was a big decision, right? Because for some advisors, they look at this and they feel a little bit overwhelmed initially, right? So we kind of show them how it works. And then, of course, they say, oh, is this Excel spreadsheet? I mean, no, it's not. It wouldn't be a good idea to build a software in Excel spreadsheet, right? But that
was a shot at one of the suppliers in this country. No, I'm kidding.
Well, the thing is, it's anything about, when you're not controlling the platform that you built on, right? So that was that's going to be a problem. And the thing is, if you control this, then you can actually make the spreadsheet more, let's say, a little bit smarter, right? So when you go to age 73 and you enter zero withdrawal from Rev, the software is going to alert you, right? You cannot have zero Rev withdrawal at that time. So you're going to save time.
No, the intelligence is definitely been in there. Also, your outputs are rather dynamic as well. Can you speak to what those reports look like?
Yeah. So once you enter the data and go through the very quick process of setting up the plan, then really the interesting part starts, right? Because then you can, for example, see, okay, well, you built your baseline scenario. But even though as an advisor, you may have a lot of experience, you may want to copy that scenario very easily and test, let's say, a what if scenario. And let's say if you make larger withdrawals from Rev versus non-registered, or maybe then there are conversations about TFSA non-registered, corporate funds, and so on. And you can make those changes very quickly. And then once you, let's say, build a couple of different scenarios, that you can actually look at this information visually as well. So we have a set of interactive charts, and you can look at, of course, at the capital assets and the estate, and also the sources of income. And the chart is quite dynamic, so you can turn off and on different income streams. And that also helps advisors to illustrate, to get that point across with clients. And some advisors actually prefer more visual information, but there's another camp that prefers the numbers, right? So we sort of provide both.
Excellent. Now, I'm curious, has anyone ever talked to you about you utilizing your software in conjunction with, say, some sort of large touchscreen monitor for presentations? Because it speaks to being, like you said, very visual, very collaborative, the ability to basically do things on the fly with the client once you've established a base. I just think that would be a natural next step for people to use your software. Has that happened yet?
I think, well, it did. I think there's some capability on Surface, which we haven't actually optimized for Surface, but people started using it that way. And I think the opportunities to go in that direction are enormous. I think we're barely scratching the surface, I think, so to speak, I guess. No pun intended. But I think technology is going to help us. And I think especially right now that there's a lot more technology to meet with clients remotely. I think that's going to be, I think if you can basically bring the client and advisor closer to each other, right, and have those meaningful conversations, and then think about what technology we can actually do to bridge this gap between them, that's going to be an interesting idea, right? But again, we have to optimize for sort of different use cases because some advisors still like to print out the static report, right, and give it to a client, maybe go over with the client, and that makes sense for them.
Yeah, absolutely. You need both. You have the older clients who are going to want that. You have the people who want to get more pedantic down to the minutia of the data. I typically produce a 20-page executive summary, but a 10-slide show that basically, distills it down to the core elements. So in terms of, tell me about the challenges you've had in terms of developing the software, what you've encountered thus far.
Lots of challenges.
Always a loaded question for people who are startup entrepreneurs.
Yeah, so I think we've built the software in a way that's it's kind of interesting. It's kind of unique in a certain way because when we did early surveys on the software, and we had maybe a couple of hundred users at the time, it was maybe a year and 2 years ago, I looked at the data, and when there was one question specifically, I was very curious to find the answers to and review the answers. And the question was, what would you use if Snap Projections were no longer available? And a lot of people would tell us that they wouldn't use anything. Or some people, and that was shocking to me, right? Because I was expecting there would be, some people would say, for example, Excel, maybe there was a number of competitors in the market. There's some really good planning software packages on the market too, right? But it was very interesting, right? Because we sort of found a niche, and we found a niche that people wanted to get basically to get to details, I guess, get to business very quickly and see the numbers. So that was very interesting. And I think the whole process of building the product, the decisions that you have to make, whether you build new features so you can serve additional, you can expand your market, or whether you really polish the features that you have. That's a big decision, right? And you have to also make decisions on what is the area in the application that your users are going to be using most often, right? And you have to focus on that. So that was kind of more product decisions and building the software. And we're building the software iteratively, right? So just releasing features, testing, sometimes maybe even taking a feature away if we didn't find it was useful. And we still have a lot of work, but that was kind of on the product side. The other thing is, I can openly talk about that. We are completely self-funded company, right? So we have. I should probably clarify that there's no equity funding that we've ever accepted. We were supported generously by some of the grants, provincial, federal. But so that was a huge challenge, of course, right? Because you have limited resources. And you're trying to build a product in pretty established industry when the standards are pretty high. So that was definitely a challenge and just building the team. But, we got to the point that we've been growing very quickly. And that was kind of interesting time for us because in order to accelerate what we are doing right now, we've been actually thinking about funding and maybe we're just open a little bit more. But that was definitely a challenge.
So, and that leads to a curious question. So you're talking about things you're looking to accelerate in terms of growth. Can you tell me what's in your product pipeline? Like, what are you looking to develop at this point?
Wow. That's another big question. So we have, I looked a couple of days ago, and I think we have over 500 feature requests on the list, and some of them are well documented. And you know what? If somebody, is surprised by that, typically, if you build a product, you will have a lot of feature requests from clients, right? But then those feature requests, it can take you in different directions. So you have to be very strategic about adding those features. And really, even if we have even increased our development team to, let's say, 10 people right now, we still would probably receive another 500 feature requests over the next couple of weeks. So now I think it's more about strategic decisions, right? Because we have to think about what is the core client that we serve, right? What is this kind of advisor and who is this advisor, right? And then we're looking basically at a lot of your features. So, and I think in financial planning space, there's still a lot of problems, I would say, a lot of things that have not been addressed properly, right? Most planning software, actually not even Canada, but just worldwide, was mostly developed for asset accumulation, not decumulation, right? So that's definitely a big challenge for a lot of people. Other functionality, of course, talking to other software vendors, so APIs, and some being able to connect data from other sources. That's definitely a big part.
Very much something you're looking at.
Yeah, integrations, the whole client portal aspect, right? And we actually thought about it for a long time. We haven't actually done a lot in this area, but that's another thing, right? Because that's a very strategic decision for us. Another area, it's proper portfolio stress testing, right? So it's not about building a quick Monte Carlo simulation and showing different rates of return and maybe, let's say, several thousand different trials, but really looking at mortality tables, maybe longevity, inflation, rates of return, different outcomes from bond market and equity market. And also looking, what are the spending patterns in retirement, right? What are the healthcare costs? And really, I think, this could be definitely a separate product.
So what you're saying is that you're looking at making a number of integration plays potentially.
Yeah, potentially. So I think as the software ecosystem becomes much more connected, it becomes also much more valuable when you connect to other players, right? So you're thinking about pulling data from other sources, maybe pushing data out to, let's say, different systems, let's say from CRM systems and so on. I think we're very early at an early stage, because initially when I looked at the market, and it was a while ago, there was not a lot of options for actually pulling data. So we build software so we can actually enter data very quickly. You can be, as an advisor, you can be proactive very quickly. But of course, long term, I think just an API, a robust API, and being able to talk to other systems is just a must have. So that's definitely another thing. And in terms of other feature, I think we have a lot of core features that just the planning software needs that we still need to develop. And then, of course, we'll be thinking about making those decisions and making decisions on what kind of features develop. But maybe we'll go towards sort of the high-end features, and we'll think about adding maybe trust components. We have simpler corporate functionality right now in some projections, but there's a lot more that can be done. And I think financial planning is difficult also to address as a problem, because there's so many edge cases. And I think you can probably speak to that.
I live in the edge cases.
Exactly. Sometimes I do feel like, I live just basically on this edge cases as well, because we're just dealing with those kind of esoteric situations. And advisors sometimes ask us about those situations. And really, the interesting thing about this, if you think about it, sometimes advisors think about their lookup projections, say, well, in the year 2045, I would like to make this kind of decisions, and I'm sort of limited. Yeah. And it's not, financial planning is really an exercise in estimation. This is how I look at it.
A need to do that in some cases, like if they're going to basically wind down an individual pension plan or something like that, and there's going to be a known tax liability, like absolutely. But I know what you mean. Like I've seen some people saying, "Oh, it didn't handle this one case." It's like, what makes you think that one case is going to happen in 40 years?
Exactly. And if there could be maybe a workaround around that. Yeah. These are the things we're talking about. And also other things, for example, other features that we've been looking at. It's more of a more robust way of doing this portfolio stress testing. And I think that's that's an interesting problem, right? Because it's not about running just a simple sequence of returns or Monte Carlo simulation. It's about looking at the mortality tables, about longevity risk, and just looking also at the inflation, the potential outputs or outcomes from bond market, equity market over the next 20, 30 years. And looking also how people in retirement typically spend money, especially there's a difference. There's probably going to be a big difference between Canada and US, right? So those two countries.
Well, the healthcare issue, but the healthcare issue is not getting worse here too, because governments in this country don't do enough for long-term care. And that's something that's definitely going to be increasing in need going forward.
Absolutely. So I think that last feature, this could be a completely separate product. And if somebody would build something like this, we would be very happy to actually integrate with them, because
it's interesting enough, because the podcast, I think it was episode 7, was Rick Stream. Have you had a chance to look at their portfolio crash testing tools?
I have not, but I will.
You should take a look at it. So, they do a bunch of scenario analysis based on not just historical stuff, but making conclusions about what happens if there is a multi-basis point interest rate increase, and how does that impact the markets, at home and abroad, and trying conclusions on what those correlations look like going forward. So yeah, it's a very interesting thing. And it's a common resonating conversation I have. And it's just basically demographically charged by what we're facing in North America right now, in that, we both have the baby boomer population in Canada and the US, and that wealth transfer that we've been hearing about in this industry forever is finally starting to happen. And the big concern everybody always has is, will I have enough to live off of? So have you given thoughts into how that's all going to basically, you mentioned a bunch of things, but how you would possibly package that together, or what the goal is for that entire module at this point?
Well, I would say we've spent quite a bit of time thinking about it, but I think just even getting the design of that aspect, that's going to be very interesting, because what we really started with and what we've done in the past, we really built the software in increments. So right now, what we've done, we've developed simulations called sustainable simulation, right? So you can actually very quickly find out what is the sustainable level of spending for clients, assuming, let's say, their projections will run all the way to, let's say, 100 years old. And of course, you can change those parameters, right? But this is just the starting point, right? So this is just the starting point to building that feature. So I think it's a little bit too early for us to talk about, how this is going to be designed. I think there are some interesting ways of even just visualization of that information, right? That's going to be impactful. And I really want to make sure that also we not just being very practical, and I should probably say that we are very practical and very try to be effective and efficient at the same time, but we have to also look more at some of the research that has been done in this area. And I think there's some smart people who've done some research on that topic, so we should probably spend a little bit more time thinking about.
I can probably introduce you to Moshe Malevsky, so that's a different one.
I'll take you up on that offer.
All right, fair enough. So that's good. I mean, that's a hot button, and I think there's a lot more expansion coming in that regard. In terms of the integrations, I mean, one of the big things that everybody's looking for lately is right through processing. Are you guys looking at some sort of onboarding tool as well, both either to build it yourself or to team up with someone like, say, a Precise FP?
Potentially. So again, this wasn't probably one of the biggest issues, but I think the biggest issue really, what you just mentioned earlier, right, was the question that retirees ask, do I have enough money to retire, right? Or given the assets that I have, how long will my money last? That's kind of reverse of that question. For a lot of people, that was the core. So in terms of other things other sort of challenges that come up is just the user client onboarding. And then depending on the structure of the market is kind of an interesting challenge in Canada too, right? Because you have the big banks, you have some small number of independent advisors, right? And everybody from those independent advisors, they do something different. So then the question really is, if we partner up with somebody, then what is the landscape of the market? If you build something else, if you build something on our own, then again, we'll have to maintain support that. But it's a little too early for us to talk about, what we're going to do in this area. But I think, again, I mean, that's another opportunity, really client onboarding. I mean, digitizing the whole process. And I think robo-advisors have done a fantastic job in some aspects of this process. I think it's just a natural thing to happen. It's going to happen sooner rather than later.
One other thing you mentioned as a possible development piece was a client portal. Now, have you given any thought to what that would look like? I mean, to date, the most successful company at that has been eMoney in the U.S. And really, theirs is really, a slightly more built out mint.com altogether. And, I hear a lot of people grumbling about the vision for what they think the real client dashboard should look like in the future. Have you given any thought to that, or you guys have plans mocked up yet?
Again, nothing really mocked up at this point, but I think
I want to know what you're working on. Just reveal it.
I definitely want to spend more time on the interactivity aspects, right? Because I think the ability for us to go from paper to go to something that's actually changing right in front of you, that uses behavioral aspects, behavioral science, and nudges the client and the advisor to make certain decisions. I think there's a lot of work. I think it's not about that, I'm trying to hide what we're working on. I think the size of the problem or several problems that we're still working on, I think that's a real problem. And the other thing is that Canada is a pretty small country, right? So there is a limited number of advisors. So how do we make decisions about investing a lot of time and effort in going a certain direction, right? So that's another kind of challenge on the back of my mind, right? Because we don't want to be building software for 200 advisors on the other aspect. And the other aspect, what I would probably point out is that what we try to do, we try to really closely look at what our users are doing and how they use the software and learn from there. Because not just looking at competitors, because when you're looking at competitors, you might be making the same mistakes. And I want to avoid that, right?
Racing in the wrong direction.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I think we've heard this, I think goals-based planning, right? That was kind of interesting aspect. There's certain different interpretations of that. Another thing is when you especially speak to large organization, larger client, then their compliance department may have completely different view on what the software should be doing versus the advisor, right? And I think that's another challenge probably for a lot of the fintech entrepreneurs in Canada, right? Because we wanted to build the software for the advisor. We want to make the advisor a hero, just to be more efficient and more effective, and not for the compliance department, right? But so to speak. But at the same time, of course, you have to add those. If you want to serve larger clients, you have to be looking at those more enterprise sort of grade functionality. So yeah, I don't know if it's helpful, but I think again, I'm going back. I think there's still a lot of opportunity in the planning aspect, because I think by looking at even the Canadian market, most of the people were very excited about robo-advisors, right? And they really launched barely 2014, 2015. So just, 3-4 years ago. I think there's still a lot of opportunities in the planning space.
Agreed. So before we wrap up, I want to talk about your podcast, which I was privileged enough to be on. You want to fill everybody in on that?
Absolutely. The podcast that we've launched a couple of weeks ago, it's Growing Your Financial Advisory Practice podcast. And your episode, I'll just say, it was extremely popular. I've received a lot of emails, and I think there's a lot of interesting advice. So if anybody would want to listen to it, it's snapprojections.com/podcast. And you can go back all the way to the beginning, or just listen to Jason's interview, which is 006.
Well, normally I would say just listen to mine, but the first 5 were John Page, and I happen to be friends with him. So I'm going to say that they're all worth listening to, quite frankly. So, yeah, so people, if you're not sick of my voice by now, then by all means, go on and check it out. But that was a thoroughly enjoyable process. And I think there was a lot of really good business development pieces we talked about in there. And frankly, I think John is the guru of business development in this industry. So definitely worth listening to. What led you to start that, out of curiosity, before we wrap up?
A couple of things. First of all, I've managed to connect with a lot of really smart people, and I didn't have a chance to bring the knowledge that I was basically able to encounter and to share with the rest of the industry, right? We want to share this with the rest of the industry, and there's some really interesting people working on interesting things, and you will have some very interesting guests coming on the podcast very soon. That was definitely one aspect, being able to share valuable information. And I think that's what we try to do with a podcast. And just even from our own perspective, just increase the learning and just increasing the learning of the industry. I think the pace of the industry and the change of the industry is increasing right now. So that's just a really good way for me to keep in touch with great people in the Canadian industry here.
Excellent. Well, Pawel, thank you yet again for making the time. It's greatly appreciated. And this has been great. So thank you very much.
This was fun. Thank you very much. Take care.
And that was my interview with Pawel Brzeminski from Snap Projections. Hope you enjoyed that. And if you did, please leave a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever it is you get your podcasts. Thank you. And until next time, I'm Jason Pereira.
This podcast was brought to you by Woodgate Financial, an award-winning financial planning firm catering to high net worth individuals and their families. To learn more, go to woodgate.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play, or find more episodes at fintechimpact.co.